Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Forward Physio. Today, I am joined with the second coming of Erik Meira on the podcast. So Erik has joined me on the podcast about 2 years ago. And for those who don't know him, he's a physiotherapist, an educator. He's widely recognized for his expertise in sports rehab. He's the founder of the Science PT website. He was the original. He's the one of the founding fathers, I guess, of physiotherapy podcasts with the PT Inquest podcast, which he no longer is a host of, but joins every now and then. He's also the founder of the Elite Rehab Conferences in sports, so basketball, football, hockey, soccer. Are there any others, Erik, currently?
No, that's it. Yeah.
Okay, so those ones as well. And I think just how I view Erik is one of the most important, influential, and insightful speakers and faces in the world of physio. So I'm always really, really excited to chat with you, Erik. So thanks for coming on again.
That's very kind of you. Am I the second time?
I'm sorry to say, but you're the second time. Ben Cormack, I spoke to him last week, so his second episode will air soon. But Ben does not have this over you. You also unknowingly almost played a key role in me proposing to my now fiance earlier this year.
Wow. What did I have to do with that?
So you were doing your course, the knee, in, I think it was Virginia, back in like March or April.
Yeah.
And that was around the time when she was expecting me to propose to her. And she has family and friends in Maryland, which was like half an hour away from your course. And then our plan was to go there because we're based in Toronto and then go on vacation. And she thought that I was going to propose to her in Maryland because I told her that I wanted to take a course called the knee. And she's like, that has to be code for you getting down on one knee. I don't believe it.
Well, I'm glad I could help.
Yeah. I honestly think if I proposed to her, like involving a physiotherapy course, she probably would have said no. So
yeah, exactly.
I'm glad I went down a different route, but thanks anyway.
Yeah.
But we're not here to talk about the knee today. We're here to talk about Achilles rehab, actually. I listened to a podcast that you did on E3 fairly recently on early ACL rehab. And there was features of that podcast that just, hearing you speak on it really, really opened my mind and made things super clear. And I think a big reason for that was because of how you spoke about just the general environment and early principles that you think about when you're approaching rehab. So to start off with like this early Achilles repair rehab, can you just explain to us how you think about the environment sort of as it pertains to the organism and the actual Achilles itself and just the overall state of healing?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a huge difference between, something like an ACL reconstruction. You have the reconstruction of a ligament. And again, understand the difference between reconstruction and repair. Obviously, a reconstruction is you're replacing with a new graft. As opposed to a repair is you're repairing the original tissue. So an ACL repair, for example, would be taking the original torn ACL and putting it back together, which is not all that common. There are procedures where they're doing that now. It was something they tried to do a long time in the past, but they've started to get some with specific kinds of root injuries that they can do that. So like with a reconstruction, you're ripping the whole thing out. You're putting in a whole brand new one. It is rock solid from the get-go as far as its fixation, as far as the tissue itself. The fixation is kind of your concern, and it's in bone tunnels and it's anchored in pretty well. So there's usually not that much concern there as far as damaging the surgical part of it. Now contrasting that with your tendon repairs, again, that's a repair where they're actually taking the damaged tissue and they're sewing it back together. The reason they don't do that very well, like with the ligament reconstruction, is there's just not enough of a blood supply. You have to have blood supply in order to heal what orthopedic surgeons call a biological weld. If you don't have a blood supply, you're not going to get healing. Now with tendons, you do get a blood supply. So it's much more likely to heal in that situation. But again, what you're looking for, and again, surgeons talk about this, the biological weld of the materials that they're putting back together, whether it's a tendon to a bone, like we see like in rotator cuff tendon repairs, typically they're anchoring it back down to the bone. They create a bleeding bone bed and then they stick it to it.
What
We
does that
don't
mean,
quite
a
have,
bleeding bone bed?
what's that?
What do you mean by a bleeding bone bed?
So a bleeding bone bed. So like in a shoulder, in a rotator cuff repair, what they'll do is where the tendon anchors into the bone, it's usually been pulled off. That's that kind of injury.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it hasn't, what they're going to do is they're basically going to shave off what's left and then reattach. And what they do is they actually, you think of the ball of the humeral head, they're going to scuff that up to take down a layer of bone until the bone starts bleeding. And then that's what they stick the tendon down onto, and they put anchors into it. They usually use what they call a mattress suture, which is they create an X over it and really press it down over that. And then they're trying to get the body, so the bone, to weld into the tendon. And so that's that type of repair there. That's not typically what we see in Achilles. In Achilles, it's not pulling off the root as much as it's tearing right in the middle of the tendon. So you have these kind of two ends flapping in the breeze, so to speak. What you have to do when you repair that is you have to get the two ends to approximate over each other. It's honestly just like a fracture or anything else. You just got to put the two ends together. This is why like an ACL needs a reconstruction, is because the two ends are never going to meet each other. And so we have some of those, like the internal bracing and that kind of thing. That's the intent of those, is to get the two ends to meet each other and let nature run its course. Now, again, a little more tricky in an ACL because of lack of blood supply as opposed to a tendon. So they can, and with an Achilles rupture, you can just put the person into not just plantar flexion, they call it the equus position, meaning like a horse. So you're like standing on your toe. It's not just being in plantar flexion, it's being all the way in plantar flexion, where you get the two ends of the tendon to basically overlap each other internally. And they will, if you get them in that much of a position. If you can hold it there long enough, it'll heal like that. The surgery, they're going to go ahead and suture the two ends together. So the suture repair would have to fail before the actual like adhesion would have to fail between the two ends of that. And so there's a number of different procedures that they do as far as how they stitch it together. You hear everything from a Krakow to a Kessler, modified Kessler. These are all suture techniques that they're using. PARS is another one, which is a tool that they use. And then the speed bridge is another one where they actually anchor it into bone, kind of simulating what you see in, like I was describing, on the shoulder. But it's not as easy as that unless it's pulled off the bone. So otherwise it's just like an additional anchor points into the bone to help hold the whole architecture of the sutures together. It's getting a little, too inside baseball over there, as they say, if we go too far into that the surgical technique things. Essentially all they're doing is trying to find a way to use sutures to hold it together. Now, if that were to fail, it would actually be not the sutures tearing, but the sutures tearing through the tissue. So you imagine, if you were to take two pieces of paper that are separated and you were to poke a hole in either piece of paper and tie a string through the holes to tie them together. And then if you were to pull the paper apart, the string's not going to break. The paper's going to tear through. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's exactly what would happen in a frank failure of one of these. Now, ideally, if they're not on a bunch of painkillers, they're going to feel that, and they're going to feel that big time. So it's not a subtle, I think I may have done something. Typically after that surgery, they're going to cast them in that equus position, no weight bearing, get them casted down there, really let those two ends hold together there to let that weld start forming. Now you could say, well, why don't we just cast him until it heals totally? Well, that's not how the body heals things. The body heals to the demands placed on it. So it's that SAID principle, specific adaptation to impose demands. So it's not just resting it until it heals. You then have to start putting a stimulus to it to try to kind of tug on those ends to get them to start, getting a little, oh, I need to heal a little stronger than this. I'm not just going to be in a cast the rest of my life. But those first 2 weeks is totally protected. And then you have to start putting a little stimulus on it. Now, the big thing in that protective phase and that early part that you're trying not to have happen is any kind of creep of that tendon. So they'll say that it's stretched out. It's more that the tendon needs to be a certain length, and you don't want that tendon to become longer than when it was before. This is a problem we have in an untorn tendon, is when they lose their stiffness and they become kind of elongated. And what you end up with is that now the muscle has to kind of take up all that slack before it's actually getting its action on it there. So we want that tendon as stiff as possible. Now, in a non-operative situation, or not non-operative, in an unruptured situation, so just like a tendinopathy that's lost some stiffness, we just do very, very heavy loading to get that to tighten up. Now, you may think, well, but when I stretch, an otherwise healthy Achilles, when I stretch it, isn't that good? And I'm getting more range of motion. It's like, well, you're getting more range of motion. You're not stretching the tendon. You're stretching the tendon muscle complex collectively. And that's going to be more your quote unquote red tissue, which is going to be your muscle that's going to kind of give you that length from there. In a tendon situation, a tendon repair situation, your weakest link is the repair, not the muscle. And so you run the risk of actually pulling that part longer. Now it's almost impossible to undo that. And so the little trick that we use is called the Achilles resting tendon angle. And so you put them into laying prone, bend their knees, and you look at just what the resting angle is on their feet. And what you should see, what the surgeons try to do, is they try to make that a little tighter than the other side. And so you should see that stays like that. Now, no matter how much flexibility they have in their muscle, the resting tone should always be that position. It's usually in a little bit of plantar flexion. So you should see a little more plantar flexion on that surgical side than you do the other side. So in those first phases, it's protecting that. Now, here you end up with your paradox is, well, but I'm trying to load it a little bit to encourage the healing, but I don't want to stretch it out. And so that first phase, which is getting to the point of your question, that first phase, what you're trying to do is get them starting with some isometrics in terminal plantar flexion. Okay. So you put them fully in plantar flexion so that everything is on slack. And then you're just asking that muscle to contract. Now, I'll tell you right now, even in a healthy, uninjured calf architecture, if you're in terminal plantar flexion, you're not producing a lot of force.
Yeah.
And so now you're taking an injured situation and asking it to do that. You're just not putting a lot of force through there, but you're putting some force to start stimulating that healing. This is exactly, again, the analogy there with the ACL is exactly what we do in the early phases of ACL. We start engaging that quadricep and people are like, oh, but that's going to pull on the graft. It's like no more than it is good for it. We're talking about a very weak structure that's having a hard time engaging at all. It's actually a perfect activation activity for that muscle and also a perfect loading activity for that injured tissue.
It's so interesting. It's, I guess, almost fortunate in a way. Or I don't know if this is just sort of how nature intended, but that the position where we want the ends of the Achilles to approximate or to remain so that we're not pulling on the repair too much also happens to be the position where the calf is not able to produce as much force as it is in, more degrees of dorsiflexion. Is that a coincidence, do you think? Or is that just sort of pretty fortunate that it worked out that way?
I mean, if you think of that with any part of the body, I tear my bicep tendon, it's going to be the same situation. I put it all the way on slack. That's also where the bicep is very has, just mechanical insufficiency
Yeah.
wherever we do it at. Same thing like with a quad tendon, you put them all the way in terminal extension and work from that position there. And with the Achilles, we actually usually start them in a 90-degree knee position so that we take the gastroc out of it entirely. So it's just the soleus part of it. Less likely to put any stretch on it when the knee is bent as well. And I would say we never, I hate to say never, but we never work on dorsiflexion range of motion after Achilles repair. It's just something that comes back as it comes back, which is, it's kind of funny because, I think our reflex would be that, oh, it's going to seize up. It doesn't.
Yeah.
But of course, we seem to think that with everything else too. It's like, it actually usually doesn't in the other things as well, unless you have an actively aggravated joint with a bunch of effusion and then you get contractures around it. But it's not something we see.
Yeah. I was speaking to Scott Greenberg about that exact idea about not really stretching it or working on your range of motion. And he said that maybe he won't do it intentionally until it's maybe 6 months after the repair. And he's noticing that there's a big deficit still for whatever reason. But most of the time when you're doing things like squats and, lunges, eventually that will just sort of come back naturally, right?
Yeah, Scott's a great resource for that too. He spoke at the Elite Football Rehab Conference on Achilles repairs specifically, and definitely a guy that I call if I'm ever having an issue around that too. But exactly that, it's just being upright and walking around naturally stretches things out. And as a matter of fact, after Achilles repair, we use heel lifts for a long time to prevent them from stretching that out. I personally use a lot of taping. I actually prefer that over the heel lift, but we're going to use the heel lift and tape. It's never just taping in isolation.
Oh, cool. So you just tape it in the same position, but that's just for extra support, what the heel lift would normally provide, and just sort of doubling down on that.
Well, because remember, we're trying to avoid dorsiflexion, and all the heel lift is going to do is when you're standing straight upright, that you're not going to go into, it's going to keep you out of neutral. But when you go to take a step over it, it's going to go into dorsiflexion unless you have enough calf strength to stay out of dorsiflexion. And so in those early phases, I'll go ahead and tape them as well. It's a real simple, it's just a elasticon from the just distal to the calcaneus, over the calcaneus, and then up the back of the calf. So it's basically doing the job of the plantar flexors. And so we'll tape them into plantar flexion with the elasticon, and then when they bear weight, the elasticon is going to take up all of it because it's a stretchy type of tape. It'll remove all of its slack. And it usually, if you did it right, it's going to block any dorsiflexion whatsoever, but it gives them some plantar flexion movement. We use that a lot with Achilles tendinopathy too. In acute cases, we'll throw that on there just to unload the Achilles a little bit, and then put them back out there. And usually they'll feel that little extra kind of help.
You doing that sort of reminds me of, again, something I heard on that ACL podcast that you did. And I hear you do some things sometimes that maybe are not in treatment guidelines that you see very commonly, but they're still grounded in scientific reasoning. And one thing that you brought up in that ACL podcast was trying to reduce swelling a little bit. And while you don't have direct evidence to say this, if we just think about fluid dynamics and gravity, you really prop up a leg higher than we typically do. Sometimes we say just higher than the level of the heart, but you say, why not even higher if you think about like a water tower?
Exactly. Yeah. So the higher your column of water, the more downward pressure it's going to have. And so it's just basic fluid dynamics. And so now, of course, in the human body, you have a pump and all this other stuff that's pushing against it, but our lymphatic, our venous system is passive. So why wouldn't it? It's a very plausible thing to do. Yeah. And I mean, and with this, like we can have them push as hard as they can in a plantar flexion on a force gauge, and then add the tape and have them do it again. You'll see it's more.
Hmm.
I mean, and then especially as you take them to their end point, so to speak, and usually, the protocols, and this is the beauty of Achilles rehab. There's like 50 protocols out there, and none of them are, just like any other protocol. There's no way really to validate a protocol. So you just have, well, this is what we do. Here are timelines, that kind of thing. But whatever you're allowing them to drop to with the heel lift or whatever you're using, sometimes the boot is lifted. There's different boots that you can actually change the angle of the boot. Others just put padding into the boot, whatever. But whatever they're dropped to in the boot is where you would absolutely don't go past that when you're testing or anything else like that. But yeah, you put a bunch of tape into that terminal position and then look at what they're generating there or tolerating there. It's going to be a lot more. And again, that's just basic physics of it.
Yeah. I want to get into the loading protocols that you do and the rate at which we decrease the amount of plantar flexion that they're in. But before we get to that, can we go back to just sort of the concepts of healing a little bit and those principles? You mentioned that we need load originally to have a better heal. Is the idea behind that physiologically that in the early healing stages, our body is just sort of laying down collagen a little bit randomly, and then the load helps to reorganize it? Is that the idea there, or is there more to it than that?
I think of it more as a stimulus of, the body responds to its, the environment that it's in. So, it's the way your muscles strengthen because you're putting load into the muscles and telling the muscles you have to be able to handle more load than you do. And so the body is adapting to what loads it needs to handle. And so in the early phases, and I try to keep just very simple concepts like that are kind of universally true, and just keep applying as far as you can. So when I think of the early phases, when it's immobilized, it's not as immobilized as we would think. You can't immobilize it totally. So just little muscle like fasciculations or whatever that are going to happen. That's gonna be creating enough little wiggle there that it's gonna start, healing to that little wiggle. And you can kind of imagine like you're just trying to make the wiggle be more as you progress through the process.
Right.
You can imagine right when you fixate it down, it doesn't take a ton of wiggle to damage it. So you do very, very, very little, but then that little becomes more and more and more. And that wiggle is produced by, load from the muscle typically. And that's the easiest way to think about it through everything. And then you start having to get in Achilles repair rehab is a great example of this. The amount of load the Achilles naturally takes is bonkers. The torque produced by the Achilles, there's a large range because it's such a high load that it's hard for researchers to really zero in on it. But you commonly are going to see, 20 Newton meters per kilogram is very normal. Keep in mind that's very, very short moment arms. So to produce, I think it's somewhere between 19 and 20 Newton meters per kilogram is the equivalent of pushing 2 times body weight through the soleus, like as a seated soleus test. So that's where those numbers come from. But that means you have a 200-pound athlete, they're going to need to push 400 pounds on one leg through that Achilles. That's significant. So you're going from a wiggle at the beginning to 400 pounds. That doesn't happen very quickly.
You can't really just wait for it to heal. And then once it's healed, it does that, right?
Exactly. Because it's such a huge gap of what, quote, normal is. And they're like, well, why do you need so much? It's like, well, the body's going to, if it has the ability to produce that much force, it means it has to use it at some point. Yeah. And people are like, well, they try to like figure out how much force is needed. It's like, usually they're forgetting about like rate. So like ground contact time. So the shorter your window of ground contact time, the more force you need to generate in that instant. And so the question isn't how much force is required. It's like, well, how fast are they going to be? How quickly are they going to be making their steps? Because that creates exponential amounts of load that's required. So, that's where like, oh yeah, I got them back. They're out there and they're playing. It's like, yeah, look at their ground contact time. They've started to stick their foot to the ground because they can't generate that peak. They can still generate change of direction by using time to generate impulse. That gets in all the physics side of that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
this is where, you got to take a repaired tendon and get it producing body weight before they can walk. That's several months. And it takes as long as it takes. Some people are like, oh, they should have it by this. It's like, they shouldn't be stretched out. That's the thing. Number one. Then
I think that helps when you're especially not as worried about stretching them and dealing with that permanent sort of position where you have this sort of fixated, non-flexible ankle, where that doesn't really tend to happen. So I think that helps take that time pressure off a little bit.
Oh yeah. And also just get in your head, 12 to 18 months, just park that there and just be like, that's what we're looking at for that window for return. And that's where like that early loading, I mean, it's pretty simple. They're in plantar flexion already. You can take them out of the boot and again, talk to the surgeon about what they're comfortable with and everything. We get them out of the boot, have them seated. They're up in plantar flexion. I just use some sort of a wedge under their heel to make sure that they just physically can't go down below the point that we want. What to use, honestly, one of the best things is a dumbbell. The bigger the dumbbell, the higher the handle on the dumbbell, and the dumbbell handle is your heel block to keep them from going down. And then, your first thing is just getting them to just lift off of that. And then the next thing is get them to lift off of that and then just put a kettlebell on their knee and make them hold that up in the air. And if they can't hold it, what's the harm? Well, it just drops down to that spot. Okay, well, it's crushed it there. Now just do isometrics from there. They're going to produce whatever they can produce. The problem is you don't know how much they're producing until they actually lift that kettlebell. But that's where you just start with a light kettlebell, do isometrics until they can actually raise it off. And we usually have them at least once a session practice holding their heel up in the air and then add the kettlebell and see if they can hold it. And then just keep going heavier. And then you drop the heel as allowed by the surgeon's progressions from the heel lift drop, always watching that resting tension. If you start losing resting tension, then, stop. don't progress the distance anymore. I would continue to progress the strength, just keep them out of those lower positions.
Right. I'm just thinking a few weeks out after the repair and you really want to get their heel propped up. So you're bringing over this 100-pound dumbbell. Like, what is this guy doing?
Yeah. And then you're going to park another dumbbell on their knee, which is only 10 pounds.
Right. So you're saying that if it can't produce that much force, then it's no problem. The heel will just drop back down and it won't stretch too much. But is there such thing as someone being too strong or being able to produce too much force for their own good at a certain point in the recovery?
I mean, hypothetically,
even if they're not going past the range of motion that they should be going past.
Hypothetically, if like they're taking too many painkillers or something like that, and they absolutely are getting no feedback whatsoever, are they able to generate more force from their calf musculature than the repair can handle? Maybe, but I imagine like somebody who's otherwise nervous system is perfectly fine and functional and they're not, altering it with pain medications in any way, there should be kind of a feedback loop going on there that if there's any sort of damage happening, it should inhibit the muscle from engaging. Again, that's why you stay away from ballistic type activities, because you're doing a slow, steady buildup. It should kind of feel everything, as you go. And this is where, some people want to delay things like 6 weeks or so until they start getting, they start feeling more confident about that repair again. But has that repair been getting a stimulus in order for it to be as strong? So most of the surgeons I've worked with will let you load pretty early.
How early?
In that way, usually 2 weeks out, we're doing isometrics, once they get out of the cast.
Yeah.
And again, it's not like you can keep them from doing isometrics in the cast. It's their muscles are going to be engaging no matter what.
They're going to be wiggling a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
again, that little wiggle, you can't help it. I mean, unless you give them a paralytic, while they're sleeping, it's going to twitch. Something's going to happen. So
Yeah.
yeah,
When we are thinking about those really early stages and the concept of inflammation and swelling, it seems like we're so averse to it and that
yeah.
it's always a bad thing when it's sometimes just a normal, natural process of healing. At one point, are you concerned about swelling? Are you trying to mitigate it? Are you telling people with Achilles repairs to elevate a lot? How do you approach
Yeah,
that?
definitely, especially when they're casted, get the foot up and, the early stages, get the swelling out as much as able. This is where, people get in that debate around like using ice. First off, if you're casted, don't know the ice is going to get very deep in there. So, I don't really care. Afterward, my feeling with ice, because yes, the inflammatory process is a necessary process. We want that, but we also want them comfortable and without things kind of quote unquote running amok. I think throwing an ice pack on there, it's just ice. It's not a steroid injection. I mean, it's superficial. It's not, we're not shutting down all inflammation. I mean, what the hell do you think ice is doing?
Yeah.
It takes the edge off usually, and it kind of numbs things, and it usually makes them more comfortable. A lot of times they feel like they're a little looser afterward. It feels, especially if you have some elevation, some compression at the same time, you'll see, the area kind of shrink, get that fluid out of there. But yeah, I'm a big fan of that swelling control, just regardless. As far as the tendon is concerned, it's gonna get thick and fat and big. And actually, the surgeons look for that. They want to see a nice fat tendon, on those follow ups. They don't want to see that thing all like pretty and stretched out.
Yeah.
It shouldn't look normal. It'll remodel as you start putting more. Remember how much load we're going to put through that thing. It's going to remodel as you put all that load into it. That's what you're talking about, getting that to organize better. One thing is getting it to stick together. That's that initial scar tissue, and that's what we're looking for. And then the other is to get it to organize. There's probably a sweet spot of load where you're getting it to organize and heal at the same time. I would say you're probably really close to putting too much load into it. If you're up, surfing that line, that it's probably not worth it. And so it's one of those that theoretically there's probably a line there that exists, but I personally wouldn't be that comfortable getting after it. And I don't know that the body would feel that comfortable loading that close to that line that you're actually getting that, like full remodeling going on at the same time.
Right.
So, we're looking at, and again, if you look at a force position curve on the ankle for the plantar flexors, you're not getting heavy load into those tissues until you're dropping to neutral. And a lot of times you're not dropped to neutral to, 4 to 6 weeks out, or 4 to 6 months out. Sorry. You're not dropping to neutral. Some protocols have it way earlier, but
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like a lot of the time when I've been working with someone after an Achilles repair, they're at neutral prior to that.
by 3 months, usually
Yeah.
a lot, but I've been seeing, our protocol is we're not taking them. Like I've seen surgeons leave them in a 1 centimeter heel lift for a year.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
The idea there is just because that's a little trick you do too with an Achilles tendinopathy is you throw a heel lift in it in them, and usually they'll feel a whole lot better really quick because it just unloads it just enough. But the idea there is just to give it a little help because it's going to need a little help. You're not going to be at a normal force production for a long time. So, as far as because we're also talking about heavy loading. So it's getting into those heavy loads. A lot of times you're going to look for like normal gait and all of that to happen, where you're getting a good solid push off. And this for me is always a challenge with an Achilles is getting that solid push off is hard when you won't let them go into dorsiflexion or even to neutral, because to get the push off, you got to get to neutral because that's where the force production happens. So you're trying to strengthen them in a weakened position, which this is again one of my criticisms around like with like knee rehab is we're doing everything in terminal knee extension. It's like that's where the quadriceps at its weakest. That's not how you strengthen a muscle. You strengthen a muscle in its mid range, and so getting that Achilles, that's the paradox. It's like I need to be in the mid range so I can load it heavy, But when I get in the mid range, I run the risk of kind of stretching that out.
Yeah. So you wait a little bit, and then you're able to produce a little bit more force, but also it's a little bit safer at the time.
Yeah. My personal feeling, because I have seen some research around this, and I've heard people commenting on this. We protect it so aggressively in the first 6 weeks, just to then have it stretch out in the second 2 weeks. And so, or second set of 6 weeks.
Yeah.
This is where, to me, that second set of 6 weeks, we really just kind of pump the brakes on everything. And we're just focused, same thing. We're just trying to get more and more force production in plantar flexion, trying to get them to get a push off during gait, so that they can protect and not go into passive dorsiflexion when they're walking.
Yeah. There's maybe some physios or some schools of thought where we focus way more on kinematics than kinetics. And we obsess over things like gait and normalizing gait, and mostly thinking about it from a movement perspective. How much do you focus on that after an Achilles repair?
I
On
don't.
normalizing gait, and how do you actually do it, and at what point in
I
time?
personally don't. The best way to normalize their gait, put them on an Alter G, take the, a gravity assisted treadmill, take their body weight down to whatever makes the gait normalize. You'll see it normalize. It's pretty amazing. And that's actually what, if you have access to a gravity treadmill like an Alter G or a Boost, just keep adding. That's basically your rehab. It's just have them walk on that right where their gait mechanics start to break down, bring it back just a little bit so they're fairly normal, let them feel that normal. I'll usually put a camera there, and then we just creep it up by 5% and say, now they're right at that stress point. And then over the course of rehab, you should see that, work its way up pretty well, but you can get them on that pretty early. I mean, you can you look at your percentage of body weight that they're getting in their soleus position, and then put that percentage to the Alter G or Boost and just use that. Yeah. But this is where, like, sometimes, I'll be working with an athlete and they're off the crutches, but you can see them limping. Like typically with an Achilles, they're going to throw the foot out to the side, kind of point it out so that they're not going over the toe anymore. They're just out to the side. And then they just kind of, lock that knee out straight and kind of vault over it in that way without actually, with a heel lift and everything like that. I'm like, oh, look how ugly that looks. They're clearly not using their Achilles. It's like, yeah, because it can't take the load. I mean, we established that with the force production test that we just did. So, like, well, it should be on crutches to normalize the gait. It's like, well, first off, crutches don't normalize gait because you're using crutches. I mean, your gait is altered because you're using a crutch. That's different than quote normal gait. So already your gait's altered.
Right.
And so the point is to unload it enough that you don't, stretch it out, overload, that kind of thing, which also is what their limp is doing when they have their toe out like that. So, now, is your concern that 2 years from now, they're going to be running down the football field with their toe out like that? that's going to become that's going to become their normal gait pattern. It's like, when you think of it in that way, it's kind of absurd. And if somebody acquires a strategy like that quickly, once you take away the thing that makes them walk like that, they should acquire a better strategy that quickly the other direction. Maybe it takes some cueing, but it shouldn't take much. That's been my feeling around, like, as you're saying, like from a neurodynamic perspective, I just don't know that our systems are that fragile that limp, because I think people get in a mindset that the limp is some sort of like wiring problem. And it's like, no, it's that it can't take load. Either it's feeling pain and it's trying to avoid pain, or it's just weak and it just can't take the load anymore. So it's going to find whatever strategy is most effective to ambulate. Right. And that strategy might look wonky to you, but if you want to fix the strategy, you have to fix the cause of the strategy, which is not the quote unquote wiring. If you've tested that their Achilles is taking, more than body weight and they're still using that strategy, well, it means that now you can start coaching them out of that strategy. Because sometimes they just get lazy. I have a lot of athletes that, after an injury, like stop limping. Like, actually, this is how I walk. Like, it's actually how I walk. Like you see like videos of them like on a sideline or something like that. And you're like, oh, you have like a pimp limp.
Yeah.
And you're like, that is how he walks. So, okay, well, what am I fixing then?
Right.
Walk better, walk like a normal upright individual. It's like, no, just let them walk how they walk.
Yeah.
I'm more concerned with performance, like in the sport itself. And yeah, if they're limited in their force production to the point where they're limping during normal gait, we're not even talking doing anything similar anywhere near, a quarter or pitch.
Yeah. I dove into a lot of detail with your buddy Jared Boyd about just like at what point in the ACL process do you start focusing on, like, I don't know how to define this perfectly, but I guess movement quality, and just in terms of like people moving in a way where it seems like maybe they're protecting. And I used to make the mistake with like jumping, for example, earlier on in rehab, where I would say that doesn't look right. Let's cue this and cue that. And really the problem was that in this case with the ACL, it's that they didn't have sufficient force production qualities in like the knee extensors. So
why you
just fixing that constraint, then it will sort of start to look a little bit normal after that. And he said it's not really this wiring problem. And I think like maybe that's true unless you get to the point where you're really, really far out and you give them a really simple cue and then they're able to do the thing in the way that you're asking them to do it. Like maybe at that point, it's a motor control thing, right?
Yeah. And so when we get to like the quote unquote wiring things, this gets into the complexity of how humans move and how they know to move. I mean, it's not like a wire going from the brain to the quad. It's thousands of wires going to individual motor units. I mean, the complexity of it is insane. It's not actually even something you can, it is the same as coaching. Like, I want to change your jump shot. It's the same as that. It's, what have they like hardened as an effective strategy? And you have to use the same sort of like behavioral modification, operant conditioning, all these reinforcement learning, all these very complex coaching strategies to get somebody to change their strategies beyond just give them a constraint and let them find the optimal outcome from that constraint, which is typically what you see there. Right. And that's where, it's almost always the capacity, like sort the capacity out. And if you haven't sorted the capacity out, I don't even know, like I said, you can sort capacity, put them on an altered G and, have that equal there. I used to work on like rate early because I thought, oh, rate's something we got to get back. It's like, you can't do, like, the rate isn't even applicable until you have enough force production, peak force production. So you have to be under that umbrella of force production in order to produce rate within that. So it's kind of a waste of time to work on rate like really early when we're going to lose that rate as we build up force production anyway. So, it's, I don't know that it matters that you work the two together. I don't think you're doing any harm. I just think, it's not necessary. I get into that a lot of like, people are like, well, why wouldn't I work at that at the same time? It's like, well, you can, but it's not necessary. And sometimes you're going to end up with a very frustrated athlete. Sometimes you have a frustrated athlete because they're bored and not doing enough. Okay, we'll give them something, but that's a different problem you're addressing. You're not actually fixing the rate issue like long term. You're giving them something to do to keep them engaged, and that has its own qualities to it as well. There's lots of things we'll do from that. I'm a big fan of, I get an athlete back in their environment as fast as possible. Having an Achilles repair, get them in a boot. They're able to be full weight bearing in the boot, even though they're plantar flex something ridiculous. Let's get on the basketball court. Let's start shooting some shots. I mean, we're not going to be doing jumpers or running or anything like that, but let's just stand at the line and do free throws. Let's, I would even put them in a chair with the cast on and be, shooting some shots or something like that. Just get them back in that environment as quick as possible. I'm also a big fan of, from that same perspective, if the capacity has hit a certain point, that there's a good bit of stuff that they can do in their normal weight room activity routine, I'm going to get them back with the team as quick as I can to be doing that part of the routine with the team. That's especially like college athletes, for example, and just make sure your strength coaches are good about knowing the limitations that this person has at the time. But yeah, it's like, oh, get them in a boot, start doing some RDLs. They can do upper body. They can ride a bike in the boot. There's a lot of modifications you'll have to make, but yeah.
I love the idea of returning people back to their environment really early on. I find that so often we're really, really afraid to do that because we have this black and white thinking of like, if you're on the basketball court, you're playing basketball. And really, like, you could do all these fun drills and get people to really go a little bit less stir crazy in the rehab process. It's like 12 to 18 months, not on the basketball court. Like, that's crazy.
No, we're talking about like with ACL reconstruction, you don't need much of a quad to sprint. Like once you have your basic amount that you need, like you can be, I don't know, like, over 2 Newton meters per kilogram, usually somewhere around there. If you get to like 2.3 Newton meters per kilogram or so, you should be able to tolerate running pretty well. And then they can actually be working on sprints. The thing they can't do is decelerate because that's what requires the big lion's share of the quadricep. All that quad strength that's naturally there is for deceleration. That's what it really is there for. And so as long as you don't have them decelerate, they can be out there running sprint drills and that kind of thing. And again, get them back with the team and just let everybody know, look, they can't decelerate. And if they can't decelerate, they can't change direction. So we're until they can decelerate, we're not going to do those things, and we're not going to do deceleration until they have enough quad to do deceleration. So, but that's an example of it'll look like, wow, they're doing a lot, and it's like, well, yeah, because they have a lot in that sense. It's like, wow, they're doing an RDL with like 400 pounds, like, because it doesn't ask anything of the quadricep. It's so, yeah, let her rip. I mean, stop acting like there's like this whole that everything is in the same like linear fashion of growth. It's like, well, no, there are things that require what they have a deficit on, and there's things that don't require what their deficit is in. And so let them do the things that that's a whole process, is have the deficit be the limiting factor for everything. So if it's not a limiting factor in a task, well, then they can do that task and go ahead and work on that. And that's where you could be working on skill acquisition and that kind of thing. But for me personally, like if I'm dealing with a high level basketball player, the last thing I'm doing is going out on the court and working on drills. I am not a skills coach. Can I do some drills? Sure. Do I think I'm an NBA level skills coach? No, that's a very specific job that's highly specialized, that is at a level that is so much beyond. Now, can I go sit in on a skills coach workout and pull the skills coach aside and go, hey, these are the things I'm thinking they're going to do well with, and we're going to try to encourage these types of activities over here. I think are going to be a challenge, and we should just avoid them for right now. But I want you to take advantage of what they have available to them. And that's with any kind of rehab. That can be coming off a tendinopathy. It's just like they have an old tendinopathy that's limited them for the last 3 years, and we just worked on sorting that out, like a patellar tendinopathy or something like that. And so then you can go to the skills coach and go, look, I think we've unlocked some things by letting that tendon be able to take a lot more load than it used to. Like it's taking a whole lot more load than it used to. Let's go ahead and get into these types of activities to see, back to that skill issue and that movement quality issue. They've learned a strategy to shield that tendon, and they've been using it for the last 3 years. They've gotten really kind of hardened into that strategy that's effective for them. Go ahead and just let that nervous system experience that there's a new strategy that might be available. Once it experiences like, oh, wait, what is this? A lot of times what the athlete will say is like, I made that move, and all of a sudden I was like, my whole body was like, whoa, I haven't had that for a while. And usually they had it before, and they'll pick that strategy right back up again pretty quickly with just a little cueing and a little encouragement, again, from the skills coach, not from me. but I'm working with that skills coach to go make it part of the task. Because what we do know about movement acquisition, so to speak, is that the more task related it is and the more automatic it is to the task, the better it's going to transfer. So meaning they're not thinking about the thing they're trying to load. They're thinking about being successful in the task.
Right.
And you just create constraints to drive that. So
Yeah. Beautiful. You saying that idea about the RDLs and the ACL, the fact that people could do these incredible things, but it doesn't really address the problem, or it's working around the problem, reminds me of when Aaron Rodgers had torn his Achilles, and maybe 2 or 3 months after the repair, he was back on the field throwing, and everybody's freaking out. And you
right.
can see he's like not really loading his
It's
Achilles.
fine.
Yeah.
You know how
So
much tape is in that boot, in that under
right,
that sock.
right. It was so silly, but you said that late in the ACL process,
Mhm.
deceleration is a big it's a big hurdle to overcome. And you mentioned, early on in the Achilles process, you may have someone sit down in a chair, shoot some basketballs. I think
Yep.
people could really easily work their mind around what is too dangerous,
Mhm.
especially really, really early on in that process.
Yeah.
What are some things that an athlete may struggle with later on when it comes to an Achilles repair? All right, we had a little bit of some technical difficulties, but we are back. I'm in a new setting. Erik is still at home. But the question that I was just asking you, Erik, was what are some movements or tasks that athletes struggle with in the later stages of an Achilles repair?
Yeah, so it is similar to with like an ACL reconstruction, where hard deceleration is really a big challenge for them. When you're decelerating and doing a hard decel, specifically in the sagittal plane. So, a 505 is a great example of the test. And we talked about that before. So going, 15 meters, turning around and running 5 meters back, but you're at max sprint speed when you go into that 180-degree change of direction. You do it towards the left, you do it towards the right. When you turn towards the left, your left leg is doing the bulk of the work to decelerate you. So it's your inside leg. And a lot of people get that kind of confused. They think it's the outside leg that's doing the bulk of the work. The outside leg is only doing the final plant pivot and the initiation of acceleration. It is not handling all that momentum. That should all be under control by the time you get there. Injuries actually happen when you don't have control going into that last step. So when body mass momentum is not under control, then you put way too much and you're trying to do basically everything with one step. You're trying to decelerate a whole lot of momentum and plant and pivot and accelerate out. And that's just too much for the system. So we looked at that inside leg, and just like the quad is a large contributor, the plantar flexors are as well. So you'll see very similar type issues there. And so the big thing with that type of task is that the ground contact time is relatively short, or ideally would be relatively short, especially if you have a lot of velocity. So you're moving with a whole lot of momentum and you're trying to stop quickly in as few steps as possible. You don't have a lot of time that your foot's in contact with that ground. So you're trying to generate it very, very quickly. So it's not just a matter of can they generate the force, it's can they generate the force in the time window required. And again, as we mentioned with the Achilles and the calf complex in general, it easily produces 2 times body weight. And so that's really a lot. You think of like somebody coming back from an ACL reconstruction. We're like, oh yeah, that quad it takes forever for that quad to get fully back. Well, the quad only has to get about a body weight worth of load, whereas the calf complex is 2 times that. So, and with an ACL, it's typically the joint that's telling the quadricep to kind of take it easy. But the actual muscle complex is relatively intact, even if you have an autograft coming from the bone patellar tendon bone. You still have 2/3 of the patellar tendon that's perfectly healthy, perfectly capable. And with a quad tendon, you have a whole lot of the muscle that's perfectly capable and healthy. A lot of times in those situations, are more dealing with pain. But when you're talking about, the calf complex, you have a repaired tendon that needs to take 2 times body weight. So again, you have a 200-pound athlete, it needs to take 400 pounds of load, which is a significant amount. So those types of activities are typically where you're going to see the issue, as opposed to day-to-day things like walking, even running. A lot of times, again, as long as your ground contact time it can be fairly long, so they can take like long pushing strides to get up to speed, you're not going to notice it as much. And it really is, those really high intensity like decels is where we usually see it. And then curling towards, it's always that inside leg that's doing the bulk of the work.
Yeah. Is that because they can't really get to those peak forces yet? Or is it more about the rate? Or is it about a mixture of both of those things?
It's kind of a mixture. I mean, getting to the peak force at some point, and usually it's a 5-second test is what they're going to do. So can you get to it over 5 seconds? That is actually a relatively high bar, because we're still asking for 2 times body weight. But the next question is, in what time window do you hit that peak there? And so that requires rate. And we had talked about that before. Like, rate's super important, but rate is a relation of peak. So meaning, you can only be as fast as you are strong, if that makes sense. And so if you're not particularly strong, you can be fast there, but it doesn't matter because you can't produce a whole lot of force anyway. So
Right.
You're getting, your crappy force in a very small window. That's not particularly useful. What I know Terry Grindstaff used to say this all the time at Creighton. If you're going to hit, if you're thinking of like punching somebody, it's like, it doesn't matter how quickly you punch them if you have nothing behind it.
Yeah.
So you have to have rate with it. The two kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah. You need to be able to punch the ground pretty hard in order to change direction effectively enough to actually, evade someone in your sport. Right.
Yeah. And that's a good analogy, because that's exactly what the athlete will report. Is like, they have no oomph when they hit the ground. It's like, they can generate if you give them time, but when they go to hit it, it's just like hitting with a wet noodle. It just doesn't really transfer energy into the ground.
Right. So what do you do in the weight room? Do you have a preferred method of really getting their peak forces up there?
I mean, we use a lot of, we have access to ice kinetics, both, like the single joint, like a Humac or a Biodex type thing, but also we've recently got a closed kinetic chain one, like a Poseidon, or like a 1080 makes their big device as well that kind of does that. So we're able to do that kind of work. We do it, obviously in a Humac or ice kinetic machine, we just attach their foot to the machine, and then we just use that the CPM setting, and then just have it kind of work back and forth, have them work on rate with that. And then with the closed kinetic chain ice kinetics, then we're doing like seated soleus, and then into standing. The big thing with, most tendinopathy type things or tendon related things is just really getting that peak up as high as you can.
Right.
And you're just not going to get that concentrically, because you can't generate as much concentrically as you can isometrically as you can eccentrically. And so It's the eccentric load that really is the high one that we're concerned about during task in a very small time window. The problem is when you're trying to condition somebody to take that load, because of the small time window, the size of the spike of load is kind of erratic. It's really hard to control that. So especially when you're working with somebody like a tendinopathy in particular, where they're going to have pain when they get to those certain peaks, is where isometrics come in really handy. People think of isometrics as like, well, they're safe, or it's like they're accommodating is what they are, and they have a higher ceiling than a concentric. So this is really the utility of it, is that you can hit a higher peak than you can concentrically, and then you don't have the uncontrolled nature of eccentrics, especially high rate eccentrics. So we get that as high as we can isometrically, and then some people will then work on eccentrics in as controlled an environment as possible. Not going to disagree with that. I personally feel like once their isometrics are where they should be, and we're just comparing that to the other side of what's normal for them, then go ahead and start putting them into tasks like decelerations, those types of things where they can start to, use it. And again, as long as you start with a longer ground contact time, you're not going to get quite the spike. And then you're just trying to shorten the contact time by having them do it faster. So things like step backs where they jab step, that kind of thing. Don't let them put their heel down. The cue I'll often give them is, imagine you have a thumbtack in the heel of your shoe. And so you just don't want to put any weight through that heel. It's all through the toe that you're getting that stab through there. And then I'm personally a big fan of like Olympic lifts. So like, clean, that kind of thing. Not just because of the concentric part, which is where a lot of people focus on. And this is where we've gotten away from those Olympic lifts, because people are really focused on like the throw part. And my big thing is then the catch part. Like, can they receive weight quickly? That's especially true for like quad type things there. So I'm a big fan of, we do a lot of low catch hang cling. So like they'll do a hang cling, but what I care about is how low they catch the weight. And then we just try to drive the weight up as far as the mass of the weight gets higher and higher.
Cool. So a couple questions there. For the isometrics, I'm curious at the angle that you do them at, if you do multiple ones, or if you're just trying to find the angle where they're able to produce the most force and hanging out there. But also I'm curious about if clinicians like myself don't have access to a Humac or a Poseidon. Do you feel like the rehab can still be good enough to get them back to sport? And what sort of alternatives would you do instead of those isokinetic machines?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the thing with those isokinetic devices is the benefit of an isokinetic is that it is adapting to whatever you can put out. So the speed is held constant. So it's whatever you can push is what'll let you push. People forget that even, you don't have the money to buy those types of machines, which are admittedly very expensive. You do have an isokinetic in your toolbox. It's called the isometric. Isometric is constant speed, 0. As long as you're just pushing into something that won't move, as opposed to holding a specific weight. If you're pushing into something that won't move, it is accommodating resistance. So it's going to, let you take whatever you feel comfortable with. So, and then to that other point of like what angle to work at, some people like to work at different angles. And I'm not opposed to that if you're finding they have a deficit in a very specific angle, but that's assuming that they are normal as far as their force production at the peak angle, which is usually right in the mid range. Again, we talked about this, like with people focusing on like quad sets and straight leg raises, like, yeah, but they don't have any terminal extension control there. It's like, yeah, it's at a mechanical insufficiency, and look at the strength in the mid range. It's also terrible. Their strength is bad. And then you're putting them into mechanical insufficiency and saying, get stronger here. It's like, that's the one place they can't get stronger because they just don't have the ability. So put them in the mid range. And so for the calf complex, it's right about it's from terminal dorsiflexion to 0, pretty much neutral. And so when we're doing that, and of course with like Achilles rehab, you're staying out of that range for a long time. So it's kind of hard to get them heavy load. That we talked about that as being kind of the paradox of that. But like later on, or like a tendinopathy or something, what we do is we just put them into terminal dorsiflexion at the start position, and then we have them do the calf raise. If they get past 0, it's too light. They should be able to, they can't get past 0, and then they just hold there. Typically, those stiffness protocols are looking at like a 6-second hold or so. But yeah, mid-range is the key for isometrics. I mean, with all this stuff, and this is something when I would take interns, the thing, whenever we're talking exercise, and they get like so in the weeds as to like lots of little details, I'll just go, hang on a second. What is the goal of what you're doing? Well, my goal of doing this isometric is I'm trying to get the peak isometric as high as possible. Okay, put them in the position that's going to get the peak isometric as high as possible and work there. Okay, that's what you care about. Don't worry too much about the other stuff. Then, change your goal as you need, but don't lose sight of what your goal is. I used to see that like with people doing band walking, they're obsessed about like pelvic tilters. It's like, what's the goal of the band walk? Well, I'm just trying to load the glute medius. All right. Well, how do you know they're loading the glute medius? Well, they point and say it burns right there. Mission accomplished. It doesn't matter what their pelvis angle is or whatever. If you're getting the fatigue at the spot you're looking for, you've done the job. You don't have to now overcomplicate this in any way. When people get into task transfer, we talked about that before. Task transfer doesn't work like that. Okay. Do the actual task for task transfer. The other things you're doing are just trying to build the capacity of the tissue to participate in the task.
Right. For sure. I love it. It's always good just hearing you clarify these things, because I feel like we really, really get lost in the weeds, as you said, when it comes to exercise. We're always focusing on the weird things and like just these particular movements. And we have to take a step back and ask, like, what are we actually trying to do here?
Yeah. Keep it simple until you have to not keep it simple. That was the example I was giving with the isometric of like, well, yeah, it's eccentric. I'm going to get a higher bit, but it's complicated up there when we get into eccentrics. And this person we're talking about can't even do can't match the isometric yet. Well, why are you wasting time on eccentrics then? That's so complicated. Just put them in an isometric situation, get that number to normalize. That's so much easier than trying to work eccentrics. And then once it's normalized, it's like, all right, well, now let's go try the task, because maybe it's close enough that that very intelligent organism as an organism can take it from there. Let it do the complicated part. You handle the simple things really, really well, and then let that complicated organism handle the complexity.
And if you're dealing with the athletes that you work with, I'm sure they're very okay at just dealing with that complexity on their own. It's what they've been doing their whole life.
Yeah, that's the biggest challenge with those athletes, is that they will trick you into thinking that everything is great, because they will go out there and perform in spite of capacity issues. And this is one of the things I often do, is taking an older athlete who's got 3 or 4 injuries, and when you evaluate them, they have not restored capacity in any of those areas. They're just out there with so much gifted skill that they're able to work around those things. And so this is where you get that rest to wellness fallacy, where you'll take an extremely high level athlete, they'll have a tendinopathy or a patellofemoral joint pain or whatever, and you just rest them and then gradually get them back to things. What they end up doing is finding a new strategy around that, because they're so good at that. That they've just basically said, you know what, my game can still be effective if I just drop this part of it. And they're just that good. And so, but you start collecting 3 or 4 of those, and now you have an athlete that's like, I just, anytime I try to do anything, all of a sudden, like, I've become sluggish and I can't go left anymore. And, things like that. And you're like, hang on a second. You start looking at, and it's like, again, you see it all the time. They have 4 or 5 things that they've never actually restored the capacity to. So like, they're stress shielding at the knee, they're stress shielding at the Achilles. All these things just start adding up. They've lost everter strength on one side, and you're like, wow, how is this person functioning? This is where, people get mixed up thinking, if I just work somebody, make them really strong in the weight room, I'm going to make them a better athlete. It's like, no. Athleticism, all that's a skill. Yeah. I can take 2 exactly identical people in the weight room, and one is a Hall of Famer and the other one can't make a minor league, and I can't even perform in a rec league. I have professional athletes that when you look at what's normal for them as far as like force production, this kind of thing, it's nothing surprising. It is nothing extraordinary. It's just normal force production. They just have a skill set and an ability that's a completely different thing.
It's so cool. It's so interesting. But our jobs are to have them have the capacity restored so that they can then express their skills to the best of their ability.
That's exactly right. Usually it's that loss of capacity that creates the issue. It's not that they lack some sort of skill. But yet we're trying to like train movement or something like that. It's like, they don't lack that. They lack the capacity, and that's why you're seeing what you're seeing. Yeah.
Cool. Erik, I feel like I could ask you just a million questions all day, but I think the podcast has already gone on for quite some time.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any like, closing remarks that you feel like we haven't gotten to yet, or just some words of wisdom for young clinicians?
Yeah, I mean, something I say all the time is do the boring things exceptionally well. So don't just do a good job at them. Don't just be thorough. Do exceptionally well. We move on too quickly to something else, and even when you do move on to the next thing, come back to it and make sure you don't have what they call like a slow leak. The basics, just stick to the basics. When I'm asked to consult on like a high level case or something like that, it's never something complicated. It's always some very basic thing was just overlooked or was just assumed to be good. Put a number on it, quantify it in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the big thing I stress to everybody I work with.
Cool. I love it. In a world where we're definitely overcomplicating way too much, I think those are really that's really sound advice. Erik, thank you once again. I really appreciate it. Maybe there'll be a third one day, but thank you for coming on for the second time. And I learned a ton, and I know everyone else will as well. It's always actually good speaking to you, as opposed to the hundreds of hours of other podcasts that you have out there. So, thanks
Yeah,
again.
thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.